am Gresham, and welcome back to Gresham Reads Graceling by Kristen Cashore. Today we are reading chapter 19 of this fascinating story. What had happened in the previous chapter was Po and Katsa had visited an inn that held information. And we had learned that there is a very high potential that King Lek of Monsea had a grace that is more dangerous than than any other potential ability. The ability to influence the minds of others through their mere words, to make everything they say seem truthful. It is a dangerous gift, and one that apparently this individual is not using properly, but rather for their own means. And they had learned this when Po had heard one of the informants informed them that Lek was blameless to the kidnapping of his grandfather, Prince Telef. It is interesting, to say the least, and to fathom that his word will travel with each person who hears it, spreading this cloud of lies. It is a terrifying thing to think of. Something even I would be cautious of. But enough of that. Allow us to continue, shall we? Chapter 19. There were two ways to get to Lek City from the inn or from any point in Sunder. One was to travel south to one of the Sundaran ports and sail southeast to Monport, the westernmost port city of the Monsean Peninsula, where a road led north to Lek City across flatland just east of Monsea's highest peaks. This road was traveled by merchants who carried goods, and most parties containing women, children, or the elderly. The other way was shorter but more difficult. It led southeast through the Sundaran forest that grew thicker and wilder, and rose to meet the mountains that formed Monsea's border with Sundar and Estel. The path became too rocky and uneven for horses. Those who crossed the mountain pass did so on foot. An inn on either side of the pass bought or kept the horses of those who approached the mountains, and sold or returned them to those who came from the mountains. This was the route Katsa and Po would take. Forgive me for the sinuses. Mine seem to be getting stuffed up like Dark's do this day. I wonder if it is pollen in the air. Lek City was the walk of a day or so beyond the mountain pass, less if they purchased new horses. The walk to the city wound through valleys growing lush with the water that flowed down from the mountaintops. It was a landscape of rivers and streams, similar to that of inland Lion, Po told Katsa, or so the Monsean Queen had written, which made the landscape unlike anything Katsa had ever seen. As they rode, Katsa couldn't content herself with imagining the strange landscapes ahead of her. Ahead For when she'd awakened to morning in the Sundering Inn, the windstorms of the night before had returned to her mind. Poe's grace would protect Po from Lek, and Po would protect her. With Po, Katsa would be safe. He'd said it simply, as if it were nothing. But it wasn't nothing for Katsa to rely on someone else's protection. She'd never done such a thing in her life. And besides, wouldn't it be easier for her to kill Lek immediately, before he said a word or raised a finger, or gag him, immobilize him, find some way to disempower him completely, maintain control and ensure her own defense? Katsa didn't need protection. There would be a solution. There would be a way for her to protect herself from Lek, if indeed he had the power they suspected. They only needed to think of it. Late in the morning, the skies began to drip. By afternoon, the drizzle had turned to rain. A cold, relentless rain that beat down and hid the forest road from their sight. Finally, they stopped, soaked to the skin, to see what they could do about shelter before night fell. The tangle of trees on either side of the road provided some cover. They tethered the horses under an enormous pine that smelled of the sap dripping from its branches with the rainwater. "It's as dry a place as we're likely to find," Po said. "A fire will be impossible, but at least we won't sleep in the rain." "A fire is never impossible," Katsa said. "I'll build it, and you find us something to cook on it." So Po set out into the trees with his bow, somewhat skeptically, and Katsa set to work building a fire. It wasn't easy, with the world around her soaked right through, but the pine tree had protected some of the needles nestled closely to its trunk, and she uncovered some leaves and a stick or two that were not quite waterlogged. With the strike of her knife, a number of gentle breaths, and whatever protection her own open arms could give, a flame began to lick its way through the damp little tower of kindling. It warmed her face as she leaned into it. It pleased her. She'd always had a way with fires. With Olin Gideon, the fire had always been her responsibility. Further evidence, of course, that she didn't need to rely on anyone for her survival. She left the flicker of light and scrambled to find it more food. When Po came back dripping to their camp, she was grateful for the fat rabbit in his hand. "My grease is still growing," he said, wiping water from his face. "Since we've entered this forest, I've noticed a greater sensitivity to animals. This rabbit was hiding in the hollow of a tree, and it seems to me I shouldn't have known it was there." He stopped at the sight of her small, smoky fire. He watched her as she breathed into it and fed it with her collection of twigs and branches. "Katsa, how did you manage it? You are a wonder." She laughed at that. He crouched beside her. "It's good to hear you laugh," he said. "You've been so quiet today. You know, I'm quite cold, though I didn't realize it until I felt the heat of these flames." Po warmed himself, saw to their dinner, and chatted. Katsa began to open their bags and hang blankets and clothing from the lowest branches of the pine to dry them as best they could. When the meat of the rabbit was propped sizzling above the flames, Po joined her. He unrolled their maps and held a soggy corner near the fire. He opened Raffin's packet of medicines and inspected them, setting the labeled envelopes onto rocks to dry. It was comfortable, their camp, with the drops plopping down from above and the warmth of the fire, and the smell of burning wood and cooking meat. Po's patter of conversation was comfortable. Katsa kept the fire alive and smiled at his talk. She fell asleep that night in a blanket partly dried, secure in the certainty that she could survive anywhere on her own. She woke in the middle of the night in a panic, certain that Po had gone and she was alone. It must have been the tail end of a dream, snagging onto her consciousness as it departed, for she could hear his breath through the even fall of the rain. When she turned over and sat up, she could make out his form on the ground beside her. She reached out and touched his shoulder just to make sure. He had not left her. He was here, and they would travel together through the Sundaran forest to the Monsean border. She lay down again and watched the outline of his sleeping body in the darkness. She would accept his protection after all, if she truly needed it. She was not too proud to be helped by this friend. He had helped her in 1,000 ways already. And she would protect him as fiercely, if it were ever his need. If a fight ever became too much for him, or if he needed shelter, or food, or a fire in the rain, or anything she could provide, she would protect him from everything. That was settled then. She closed her eyes and slipped into sleep. Katsa didn't know what was wrong with her when she woke the next morning. She couldn't explain the fury she felt toward him. There was no explanation, and perhaps he knew that because he asked for none. He only commented that the rain had stopped, watched her as she rolled her blanket, deliberately not looking at him, and carried his things to the horses. As they rode, still she did not look at him, and though he couldn't have missed the force of her fury, he made no comment. She wasn't angry that there was a person who could provide her with help and protection. That would be arrogance, and she saw that arrogance was foolishness. She would strive for humility. And there was another way he'd helped her. He'd gotten her thinking about humility, but it wasn't that. It was that she hadn't asked for a person whom she trusted, whom she would do so much for, whom she would give herself over to. She hadn't asked for a person whose absence, if she woke in the middle of the night, would distress her. Not because of the protection he would fail to give, but simply because she wished his company. She hadn't asked for a person whose company she wished. And I wonder, could she be falling in love with him? Quite curious. It certainly seems that way. Katsa couldn't bear her own inanity. She drew herself into a shell of sullenness and chased away every thought that entered her mind. When they stopped, to rest the horses beside a pool swollen with rainwater, he leaned against a tree and ate a piece of bread. He watched her calmly, silently. She didn't look at him, but she was aware of his eyes on her, always on her. Nothing was more infuriating than the way he leaned against a tree and ate bread, and watched her with those gleaming eyes. "What are you staring at?" she finally demanded. "This pond full of fish and frogs," he said. "Catfish, hundreds of them." "Don't you think it's funny I should know that with such clarity?" She would hit him for his calmness and his latest ability to count frogs and catfish he couldn't see. She clenched her fists and turned, forced herself to walk away. Off the road, into the trees, past the trees, and then she was running through the forest, startling birds into flight. She ran past streams and patches of fern, and hills covered with moss. She shot into a clearing with a waterfall that fell over rocks and plummeted into a pool. She yanked off her boots, pulled off her clothing, and leapt into the water. She screamed at the cold that surrounded her body all at once, and her nose and mouth filled with water. She surfaced, coughed, and snorted, teeth chattering. She laughed at the coldness and scrambled to shore. And now, standing in the dirt, the cold raising every hair of her body on the end, she was calm. It was when she returned to him, chilled and clear-headed, that it happened. He sat against the tree, his knees bent and his head in his hands. His shoulders slumped, tired, unhappy. Something tender caught in her breath at the sight of him. And then he raised his eyes and looked at her, and she saw what she had not seen before. She gasped. His eyes were beautiful. His face was beautiful to her in every way, and his shoulders and hands, and his arms that hung over his knees, and his chest that was not moving, because he held his breath as he watched her, and the heart in his chest. This friend, how had she not seen this before? How had she not seen him? She was blind, and tears choked her eyes, for she had not asked for this. She had not asked for this beautiful man before her, with something hopeful in his eyes that she did not want. He stood, and her legs shook. She put her hand out to her horse to steady herself. "I didn't want this," she said. "Katsa, I hadn't planned for it either." She gripped the edges of her saddle to keep herself from sitting down on the ground between the feet of her horse. You have a way of upending my plans," he said, and she cried out and sank to her knees, and then heaved herself up furiously before he could come to her and help her and touch her. "Get on your horse," she said. "Right now, we are riding." She mounted and took off, without even waiting to be sure he followed. They rode, and she allowed only one thought to enter her mind over and over. "I don't want a husband. I don't want a husband." She matched it to the rhythm of her horse's hooves, and if he knew her thought, all the better. When they stopped for the night, she did not speak to him, but she couldn't pretend he wasn't there. She felt every move he made without seeing it. She felt his eyes watching her across the fire he built. It was like this every night, and this was how it would continue to be. He would sit there gleaming in the light of the fire, and she unable to look at him, because he glowed, and he was beautiful, and she couldn't stand it. "Please, Katsa," he finally said. "Please talk to me." She swung around to him. "What is there to talk about? You know how I feel and what I think about it." "And what I feel? Doesn't that matter?" His voice was small, so unexpectedly small, in the face of her bitterness that had shamed her. sat down across from him. Po, forgive me. Of course it matters. Let me tell me anything you feel. He seemed suddenly not to know what to say. He looked onto his lap and played with his rings. He took a breath and rubbed his head. And when he raised his face to her, she felt that his eyes were naked, and that she could see right through them into the lights of his soul. She knew what he was going to say. I know you don't want this, Katsa, but I can't help myself. The moment you came barreling into my life, I was lost. I'm afraid to tell you what I wish for fear you'll, I don't know, throw me into the fire. Or more likely, refuse me. Or worst of all, despise me. He said, his voice breaking and his eyes dropping from her face. His face dropping into his hands. I love you, he said. You're more dear to my heart than I ever knew anyone could be. And I've made you cry. And I'll stop. She was crying, but not because of his words, but because of a certainty she refused to consider while she sat before him. She stood. I need to go. He jumped up. No, Katsa, please. I won't go far, Po. I just need to think, without you in my head. I'm afraid if you leave, you won't come back. Po, this assurance at least she could give him. I'll come back. He looked at her for a moment. I know you mean that now, but I'm afraid once you've gone off to think, you'll decide the solution is to leave me. I won't. I can't know that. No, Katsa said. You can't. But I need to think on my own, and I refuse to knock you out. So you have to let me go. And once I'm gone, you'll just have to trust me. As any person without your grace would have to do. And as I have to do always with you. He looked at her with those naked, unhappy eyes again. Then he took a breath and sat down. Put a good 10 minutes between us, he said, if you want privacy. 10 minutes was a far greater range than she'd understood his grace to encompass. But that was an argument for another time. She felt his eyes on her back as she passed through the trees. She groped forward, hands and feet, in search of darkness, distance, and solitude. Alone in the forest, Katsa sat on a stump and cried. She cried like a person whose heart is broken, and wondered how, when two people loved each other, there could be such a broken heart. She couldn't have him, and there was no mistaking it. She could never be his wife. She could not steal herself back from Randa only to give herself away, belong to another person, be answerable to another person, build her very being around another person, no matter how much she loved him. Katsa sat in the darkness of the Sundarin forest and understood three truths. She loved Po, she wanted Po, and she could never be anyone's but her own. After a while, she began to thread her way back to the fire. Nothing had changed in her feeling, and she wasn't tired. But Po would suffer if he didn't sleep, and she knew he wouldn't sleep until she had returned. He was lying on his back, wide awake, staring up at the half moon. She went to him and sat before him. He watched her with soft eyes and didn't say anything. She looked back at him and opened up her feelings to him, so that he would understand what she felt, what she wanted, and what what she couldn't do. He sat up. He watched her face for a long time. "You know I'd never expect you to change who you are if you were my wife," he finally said. "It would change me to be your wife," she said. He watched her eyes. "Yes, I understand you." A log fell into the fire, and he sat quietly. His voice, when he spoke, was hesitant. "It strikes me that heartbreak isn't the only alternative to marriage," he said. "What do you mean?" He ducked his head for a moment. He raised his eyes to her again. "I'll give myself to you however you'll take me," he said, so simply that Katsa found she wasn't embarrassed. She watched his face. "And where would that lead?" "I don't know, but I trust you." She watched his eyes. He offered himself to her. He trusted her, as she trusted him. She hadn't considered this possibility. When she'd sat alone in the forest crying. She hadn't even thought of it, for his offer hung suspended before her now, and for her to reach out and claim. And that which had seemed clear and simple and heartbreaking was confused and complicated again, but also touched with hope. Could she be his lover and still belong to herself? That was the question, and she didn't know the answer. "I need to think," she said. "Think here," he said. "Please, I'm so tired, Katsa. I'll fall right asleep." She nodded. "All right, I'll stay." He reached up and wiped away a tear that sat on her cheek. She felt the touch of his fingertips in the base of her spine and fought against it, against allowing him to know of it. He lay down. She stood and moved to a tree outside the light of their fire. She sat against it and watched Poe's silhouette, waiting for him to fall asleep. Well, it appears that we have a bit more time, and this next chapter is much shorter by the looks of it. So we will continue with chapter 20. The notion of having a lover was to Katsa something like discovering a limb she'd never noticed before, an extra arm or toe. It was unfamiliar, and she poked and prodded it, as she would have prodded an alien toe unexpectedly her own. That the lover would be Poe reduced her confusion somewhat. It was by thinking of Poe and not the notion of a lover that Katsa became comfortable enough to consider what it would mean to lie in his bed but not be his wife. It took more than the thinking of one night. They moved through the Sunderen forest, and they talked and rested and made camp as before. But their silences were perhaps a bit less easy than they had been. And Katsa broke off occasionally to keep her own company and think in solitude. They did not practice fighting, for Katsa was shy of his touch, and he didn't press it upon her. He pressed nothing upon her, even conversation, even his gaze. They moved as quickly as the road allowed, but the further they traveled, the more the road resembled a trail at best, winding through overgrown gullies and around trees the size of which Katsa had never seen. Trees with trunks as wide as horses were long and branches that groaned far above them. Sounds like the redwood forests. Indeed. They had to duck sometimes to avoid curtains of vines hanging from the branches. The land rose as they moved east, and streams crisscrossed the forest floor. Their route at least provided some distraction for Po. He couldn't stop looking around, his eyes wide. It's wild, this forest. Have you ever seen anything like this? It's gorgeous. Gorgeous and full of animals fattening themselves for winter. Easy hunting and easy finding shelter. But Katsa felt palpably that the horses were moving as slowly as her mind. I think we would move faster on our feet, she said. You'll miss the horses when we have to give them up. And when will that be? It looks possibly 10 days away on the map. I prefer traveling by foot. You never tire, Po said, do you? I do, if I haven't slept for a long time, or if I'm carrying something very heavy. I felt tired when I carried your grandfather up the flight of stairs. He glanced at her, eyebrows high. You carried my grandfather up a flight of stairs? After a day and a night of hard riding. Oh wait, I skipped a line. Yes, at Randa's castle. After a day and a night of hard riding. Yes. His laugh burst out, but she didn't see the joke. I had to do it, Po. If I hadn't, the mission would have failed. He weighs as much as you, and half as much again. Well, and I was tired by the time I got to the top. You wouldn't have been so tired. I'm bigger than he is, Katsa. I'm stronger. And I would have been tired had I spent the night on my horse. I had to do it. I had no choice. Your grace is more than fighting, he said. And in all honesty, I'm beginning to agree. There's something more to her grace here. It's not fighting. It's not killing. There's something else at work here. She didn't respond to that, and after a moment's puzzlement, she forgot it. Her mind returned to the matter at hand, as it couldn't help but do, with Po always before her. What was the difference between a husband and a lover? If she took Po as her husband, she would be making promises about a future she couldn't yet see. For once she became his wife, she would be his wife forever. No matter how much freedom Po gave her, she would always know that it was a gift. Her freedom would not be her own. It would be Po's to give or to withhold. That he never would withhold it made no difference. If it did not come from her, it was not really hers. If Po were her lover, would she feel captured, cornered in a sense of forever? Or would she still have the freedom that sprang from herself? They were laying on opposite sides of a dying fire one night when a new worry occurred to her. What if she took more from Po than she could give to him? Po? She heard him turn onto his side. Yes? How will you feel if I'm forever leaving? If one day I give myself to you and the next I take myself away? With no promises to return. Katsa, a man would be a fool to try and keep you in a cage. But that doesn't tell me how you'll feel. Always to be subject to my whim. It isn't your whim. It's the need of your heart. You forget that I am in a unique position to understand you, Katsa. Whenever you pull away from me, I'll know it's not for a lack of love. Or if it is, I'll know that too. And I'll know it's right for you to go. But you're not answering my question. How will you feel? And there was a pause. I don't know. I'll probably feel a lot of things, but only one of the things will be unhappiness, and unhappiness I'm willing to risk. Katsa stared up into the treetops. Are you sure of that? He sighed. I am certain. He was willing to risk unhappiness, and there was the crux of the matter. She didn't know where this would lead, and to proceed was to risk all kinds of unhappiness. The fire gasped and died. She was frightened, for as their camp turned to darkness, she found herself choosing risk. The next day, Katsa would have given anything for a clear, straight path, for hard riding and thundering hooves to drown out all feeling. Instead, the road wound back and forth, up rises and into gullies, and she didn't know how she kept herself from screaming. Nightfall led them into a hollow where water trickled into a low, still pool. Moss covered the trees and the ground. Moss hung from the vines that hung from the trees, and dripped into the pool that shone green like the floor of Renda's courtyard. You seem a bit edgy, Po said. Why don't you hunt? I'll build a fire. She allowed the first few animals she stumbled across to escape. She thought that if she plunged deeper into the forest and took more time, she might wear down some of her jitters. But when she returned to camp much later with a fox in hand, nothing had changed. He sat calmly before the fire, and she thought she might burst apart. She threw their meat onto the ground, beside the flames. She sat on a rock and dropped her head into her hands. She knew what it was rattling around inside of her. It was fear, plain and cold. She turned to him. I understand why we shouldn't fight each other when one of us is angry. But is there harm in fighting when one of us is frightened? He looked into the fire and considered her question evenly. He looked into her face. I think it depends on what you hope to gain by fighting. I think it'll calm me. I think it'll make me comfortable with you being near. She rubbed her forehead, sighing. It'll return me to myself. He watched her. It does seem to have that effect on you. Will you fight me now, Po? He watched her for a moment longer and then moved away from the fire and motioned for her to follow. She walked after him, dazed, her mind buzzing so crazily it was numb. And when they faced each other, she found herself staring at him dumbly. She shook her head to clear it, but it did no good. Hit me, she said. He paused for a fraction of a second. Then he swung at her face with one fist, and she flashed her arm upward to block him. The explosion of arm on arm woke her from her stupor. She would fight him, and she would beat him. He hadn't beaten her yet, and he wouldn't beat her tonight. No matter the darkness, no matter the whirlwind in her mind, for now that they fought, the whirlwind had vanished. Katsa's mind was clear. She hit hard and fast, with hand, elbow, knee, foot. He hit hard too, but it was as if every blow focused some energy inside her. Every tree they slammed into, every root they tripped over centered her. She fell into the comfort of fighting with Po, and the fight was ferocious. When she wrestled him to the ground, and he pushed her face away, she called out, "Wait, blood. I taste blood." He stopped struggling. Where? Not your mouth? I think it's your hand. He sat up and she crouched beside him. She took his hand and squinted into his palm. Is it bleeding? Can you tell? It's nothing. It was the edge of your boot. We shouldn't be fighting in boots. We can't fight barefoot in the forest. Oh wait, I think I got the lines mixed up. Forgive me. Is it bleeding? Can you tell? It's nothing. It was the edge of your boots. We shouldn't be fighting in boots. We can't fight barefoot in the forest, Katsa. Truly, it's nothing. Nonetheless, there's blood on your mouth. He said in a funny, distracted sort of voice that made plain how little he cared about his injured hand. He raised a finger and almost touched her lip, and then dropped his finger as if he realized suddenly that he was doing something he shouldn't. He cleared his throat and looked away from her. And she felt it then, how near he was. She felt his hand and his wrist warm under her fingers. He was here, right here, breathing before her. She was touching him, and she felt the risk as if it were water splashing cold on her skin. She knew that this was the moment to choose. She knew her choice. What happens next, I shall not be reading on the channel, as it is not safe for work content. Admittedly, it is only vaguely described, but still in enough detail that I will be skipping over it. So, let me find where I need to continue. Give me just one moment. They lay afterwards, warmed by each other and by the heat of the fire. She touched his nose and his mouth. She played with the hoops in his ears. He held her and kissed her, and his eyes flickered into hers. Are you all right? She laughed. I have not lost myself. And you? He smiled. I am very happy. She traced the line of his jaw to his ear and down to his shoulder. She touched the markings that ringed his arms. And Raffin thought we'd end this way too, she said. Apparently I'm the only one who didn't see it coming. Raffin will make a very good king, Po said, and she laughed again, resting her head in the crook of his arm. Let's pick up the pace tomorrow, she said, thinking of men who were not good kings. Yes, all right. Are you in pain still? No. Why do you suppose it happens that way? Why does a woman feel that pain? She had no answer to that. Women felt it, that's all she knew. Let me clean your hand, she said. I'll clean you first. She shivered as he left her to go to the fire and find water and cloths. He leaned into the light, and brightness and shadows moved across his body. He was beautiful. She admired him, and he flashed a grin at her. Almost as beautiful as you are conceited, she thought at him, and he laughed out loud. It struck her that this should feel strange, to be lying here, watching him, teasing him, to have done what they've done, and be what they'd become. But instead it felt natural and comfortable, inevitable, and only the smallest bit terrifying. And that concludes chapters 19 and 20. I do hope you all enjoyed, and that you all understand that I cut out a good 3 minutes of story due to the content that made it up. If you liked the video, be sure to leave a like and a comment down below telling your favorite part. Also, be sure to share the video around, as all it does is help out the channel, along with the likes. And if you enjoy the content produced on this channel, be sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you know that whenever we are exploring this fascinating world. Anyways, in the meantime, I will see you all in the next video. I am Gresham, and I will see you next time.